Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quiet. This is not a tale of kings or victories, but of people in their most fragile moments, when survival itself depended on what could be done with bare hands and simple tools. It is less about triumph and more about the small rituals, the whispered decisions, and the endurance that carried humanity through its most uncertain hours. Before we drift into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so these quiet histories can find their way into the night for others too. And if you wish, tell me in the comments your location and the time you're listening. I always imagine a map scattered with little points of light, people everywhere, listening together though apart, carried softly by the same story. Long before medicine had names, before white coats and sterile halls, there were only hands, stone, and the quiet determination to survive. In the earliest hours of human history, pain was not measured, it was endured. Bodies broke, infections spread, wounds festered, and yet people did not simply surrender to the inevitability of death. Instead, they sought out ways to resist it, often with tools as one unyielding as the earth itself. Picture a time when firelight was the only illumination, when shadows stretched against cave walls, and when silence was broken only by the crackling of embers and the low murmur of voices. It was in these places, far from any concept of hospitals, that the first cuts were made. Stone tools, sharpened not for beauty, but for necessity, became the earliest surgeon's hands. Flint blades, honed on rock and bone, sliced into flesh, not with precision, but with desperate intent. There was no understanding of nerves, no awareness of blood loss, no knowledge of germs, only the instinct to act. The act itself was brutal. A jagged shard pressed against a swollen limb, tearing skin rather than gliding through it. The person beneath the blade would clench their teeth, their body straining against the agony, yet knowing there was no other path. The pain was sharp, immediate, and unrelenting, but to endure it was to give oneself a chance at survival. In those moments, the line between healer and tormentor blurred, for both were locked in the same struggle against mortality. Some of the oldest evidence lies in bones, unearthed from the soil, whispering of procedures long forgotten. Archaeologists have discovered skulls with perfectly circular holes carved into them, edges smoothed by time and by healing. These trepanations, made with stone tools thousands of years ago, are proof that humans were willing to open the body in search of relief. Perhaps it was to let out spirits they believed caused madness, or to relieve the crushing pressure of injury. Whatever the reason, it was done with nothing but sharpened stone and steady hands, a process that must have stretched on for endless hours beneath the patient's muffled cries. The survival of those individuals tells us something remarkable. People lived through it. They endured the stone's bite, the rivers of blood, the days of infection that followed. Some healed, their bones slowly knitting itself around the wound, leaving behind a scar etched into the very structure of their skull. Others, perhaps, did not. Yet even in their deaths, they left behind lessons, shaping the path of medicine that would stumble forward through centuries of pain. It is easy to imagine how such procedures began. A fall in the hunt left a head cracked and swelling. A child writhed in seizures, their family desperate for reprieve. A warrior returned with a deep wound, infection setting in like creeping fire. Faced with helplessness, someone reached for the only tools they had, the stones at their feet. Through trial, error, and countless lives, they discovered that sometimes cutting, scraping, or drilling could change the course of illness. The process was far from clean. Stone does not glide like steel. It tears, it drags, it leaves behind edges that splinter. Flesh resisted, and blood pooled in the dirt. There were no bandages but woven fibres, no antiseptics but smoke and herbs. And yet, in the dim glow of flame, these treatments became ritual. A small group would gather, holding the patient still, whispering prayers as the healer pressed the stone into trembling skin. The air would fill with the smell of iron-rich blood and the earthy tang of crushed plants used to staunch the flow. Pain was not an obstacle to be managed, but a companion that lingered beside every healing act. In such scenes, we see the first true intersection of suffering and care. To heal was to inflict pain. There was no other way. Bones could be set only by wrenching them back into place. Cuts could be closed only by pressing hot ash into the wound. An illness could be treated only by drawing out blood or carving into flesh. The body became both battlefield and experiment, its cries echoing in caves and huts where hope fought a fragile war against despair. And so the stone blade remained, passed from hand to hand, worn down by use, sharpened again, and returned to flesh. Each time it sliced, it carried the memory of those who endured it. Each scar, etched into bone, told of human determination to push back against the inevitable. The pain was unbearable, yet in that agony lay the fragile seed of medicine. Imagine the moment after the first cut. The patient slumped, sweating, gasping for air. The healer, hands slick with blood, pressing fibres or moss against the wound to stem the tide. Around them, others waiting in silence, watching to see if the effort had saved a life or merely prolonged its suffering. The hours that followed were uncertain. Infection could set in quickly, fever could consume the body, and death could still come silently in the night. But sometimes, against all odds, the wound would close, and the patient would rise again, forever marked by the memory of stone against skin. The story of these first cuts is not just about tools or wounds, but about the quiet persistence of humanity. Every attempt, every painful procedure, was a step forward into the unknown. There was no guarantee, no certainty, only the enduring belief that something could be done, that death need not always have the final word. In that fragile hope, medicine was born. When we think of the earliest healers, it is easy to picture them as crude or brutal. Yet their hands, though clumsy by modern standards, were guided by compassion. They carried the weight of decisions that must have felt impossible, to cut into someone they cared for, to watch them writhe in torment, to hope that through suffering, healing might emerge. There is a quiet nobility in that choice, a willingness to embrace horror for the chance of life. The tools themselves were extensions of nature: flint, obsidian, sharpened bone. Each one carried a double edge, capable of hunting animals for survival or cutting into flesh for healing. A hunter could become a surgeon in an instant, and the same stone that brought death to prey could bring life to kin. That duality lingered in every strike, every cut, every hesitant incision. Over time, techniques grew. Stones were shaped more finely, cuts became more deliberate, and knowledge passed through generations. What began as desperate improvisation became ritualized practice, taught from elder to apprentice, whispered by firelight. The healer's role became both feared and revered. To call upon them was to invite both agony and hope, for their tools promised salvation, but demanded suffering. The echoes of those early acts still linger in our bones. The scars on ancient skulls tell us that people accepted pain as the price of survival. They understood, perhaps better than we do, that to live often meant to endure. Each patient, each cut, each cry in the night was a thread in the long fabric of history, weaving together the story of how humanity first learned to resist death. The first cuts of ancient stone remind us that medicine was never gentle. It was born from necessity, from the will to endure the unbearable, from the raw edge of survival. And those centuries have passed, though steel has replaced stone and anesthesia has dulled the edge of pain. The roots of medicine remain tangled in those early moments of firelight, stone, and blood. In that dim world, where shadows danced on cave walls and the smell of earth clung to every breath, the foundation of healing was carved, one painful cut at a time. After the stone had done its work, and after wounds were torn open by blades sharpened from the earth, there came another element, one that was both feared and worshipped: fire. To early healers, it was more than warmth and light. It was a power that consumed, that cleansed, and that carried with it the possibility of survival. Flesh could be cut, but it could also rot, and when decay spread like shadow through the body, the flame became the only answer. It is not difficult to imagine the scene. A wound festers, red and swollen, the air around it heavy with the sour scent of infection. Flies gather, drawn by the wetness of pus. The injured cannot sleep, cannot walk, cannot breathe without wincing. Around them, their kin grow desperate. Herbs are pressed to the wound, prayers are whispered, but the sickness grows. Then someone thinks of fire, this elemental force that reduces wood to ash, that strips the land bare, that leaves behind only purity in its destruction. If fire could consume forests, perhaps it could burn away disease as well. And so, the flesh was offered to flame. At first it was simple. A heated stone, pulled from the embers, pressed against a wound to stem bleeding. The hiss of searing flesh filled the air, accompanied by the cries of the patient as the body convulsed beneath the hand of the healer. The smell was unforgettable. Burned meat, acrid smoke, a sharpness that clung to the nostrils and did not fade. Yet when the cry subsided, and the wound stopped spilling its life into the dirt, a strange relief followed. Fire closed what stone had opened. The practice grew. Metal, once discovered, was shaped into tools, and those tools were placed into flames until they glowed red, their edges shimmering like the heart of the sun. When pressed into flesh, they did more than seal. They purged. At least, that is what people believed. The pain was beyond imagining. A scream locked in the throat, a shuddering of muscles as the body writhed under the weight of the fire's kiss. But to endure it was to push back against infection, against poison, against the creeping hand of death. In time, cauterization became ritual. Warriors carried brands, not only for marking cattle, but for sealing the wounds of comrades fallen in battle. The battlefield was a place of both violence and crude healing, and it was there that fire revealed its merciless mercy. A gash torn by a blade or arrow could spill a man's life onto the earth in moments. To stop it, a comrade would heat iron in a fire and press it against the wound, listening as the hiss rose and the flesh blackened. It was a brutal mercy, one that often saved life, but left scars as permanent as the memory of pain. The patient, if he survived, bore not only the mark of war, but the brand of survival: charred skin, twisted in unnatural shapes, hardened where once it was soft. The scar became a reminder, both of the wound and of the fire that sealed it. To some, it was a badge of resilience. To others, it was a haunting, a reminder of screams carried on the wind. Beyond the battlefield, fire reached into the lives of the ordinary. Surgeons, or what passed for them in small villages, would keep rods of iron near their hearths. When sickness bloomed too strongly, when an abscess swelled beyond bearing, when bleeding would not cease, the iron would be summoned. Those who lived in such times did not ask whether it was painful. Pain was a certainty. The only question was whether the fire would succeed in holding death at bay. The idea of fire as purifier was not just practical, it was spiritual. Many believed that sickness was not only of the body, but of the unseen world. To burn away diseased flesh was to burn away the evil that lurked within. Ritual chants often accompanied cauterization, voices raised in the hope that the flames carried prayers as well as healing. Fire, in their eyes, was a bridge between the mortal and the divine, a tool as sacred as it was terrifying. Still, for the patient, the divine did not soften the agony. To feel hot iron pressed into the body was to feel one's very being consumed. Nerves shrieked, muscles convulsed, sweat poured from the skin, and breath came in ragged gasps. Some fainted, slipping into unconsciousness only to awaken again to find the iron pressed anew. There were no soft words, no anesthesia, only the endless demand of survival. And yet, some endured. The records of ancient healers, written on clay tablets or scratched into parchment centuries later, describe survivors who carried on with their lives after the ordeal. Scars twisted their bodies, but they lived, testimony to a treatment that was as brutal as it was effective. Those who did not survive were buried quickly, their bodies still bearing the blackened wounds of fire. In the dim light of history, we see fire's paradox. It saved and it destroyed. It inflicted torment beyond imagining, yet it gave life where none might have remained. For families who watched their loved ones seared by glowing iron, there was a cruel hope, one that forced them to listen to screams and to smell burned flesh in the name of healing. Over the centuries, as knowledge spread, the practice grew more refined. Physicians of the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and later the Middle Ages used fire deliberately, as both treatment and prevention. They wrote of its uses, sealing amputations, shrinking tumours, burning away infected tissue. Some even believed it balanced the humours of the body, driving out excess black bile or purging unseen poisons. In their writings, one can almost hear the calm tone of reason, but beneath the words lies the same reality. Fire was pain, and pain was medicine. Picture the medieval physician, standing with a heated iron rod, a patient bound to a wooden chair. The room smells of sweat, smoke, and damp straw. Outside, the world goes on, but within these walls, time stretches into eternity. The physician moves slowly, deliberately, pressing the iron to skin as assistants hold the patient steady. The scream that rises echoes through the hall, a sound that could shake even the most hardened soul. Yet the physician does not falter. He believes in the necessity of pain, in the cleansing power of fire. To those who lived in such times, this was not cruelty, it was care. However terrible the moment, however unbearable the agony, it was seen as an act of preservation. To accept the fire was to accept the chance of life. Refusal was death, and so the body was offered willingly, trembling, but with no other choice, and so fire became not just a treatment, but a symbol. To be burned by the healer's hand was to walk the edge of survival, to endure an agony that carved itself into memory. Those who bore the scars carried with them not only the marks of their wounds, but also the legacy of endurance. Their flesh was living proof that fire could both hurt and heal. As the centuries rolled onward, other methods would emerge, softer and more precise. But the memory of fire lingered. It lingered in the scars of the survivors, in the writings of healers, in the rituals of warriors who pressed glowing irons to the wounds of their brothers. And it lingers still, in the knowledge that medicine was not born in comfort, but in torment, that the path to healing passed through flames that purged both flesh and spirit. After flame had scarred its mark upon the body, another tool emerged, thinner and sharper, yet no less cruel. Where stone had torn and fire had seared, the needle became a new instrument of healing and torment. Long before the age of polished steel, before glass syringes and surgical precision, there were slivers of bone, carved with care, and shafts of bronze hammered into delicate points. They pierced not cloth, but flesh, carrying with them both suffering and hope. The earliest needles were not created for comfort. They were shaped by hands that knew survival better than science, sharpened from animal bones that cracked under pressure, polished only enough to slip beneath the skin. These tools were crude by modern eyes, but to those who wielded them, they were miracles, extensions of nature, instruments through which the healer could enter the body itself. The idea of piercing the skin was not born from curiosity alone, but from necessity. Swelling had to be drained, abscesses had to be relieved, poisons had to be drawn from beneath the surface. And so, the needle was pushed into tender flesh, releasing pus, blood, or bile in streams that carried both revulsion and relief. The act was neither swift nor clean. Without knowledge of sterilization, without antiseptic or anesthesia, every puncture carried the weight of agony and the shadow of infection. Yet still, the needle was trusted, for its sting could save. In other corners of the world, the needle took on ritualistic forms. Across ancient Asia, long before the practice was given a name, slender spikes of bone and later bronze were inserted into the skin, not to drain, but to rebalance. To many, illness was more than a wound. It was imbalance, a disturbance in the unseen flow of life. The needles became bridges, delicate instruments meant to restore harmony within the body. The patient lay still, while one after another, sharp points slipped beneath their flesh. There was no explanation in the language of nerves or pressure points, only faith that pain itself could open pathways back to health. To endure such a treatment was not easy. Each insertion was a reminder of the body's fragility, each sharp sting a negotiation between suffering and trust. The needles were not thin, not fine like those we know today. They were thicker, heavier, and each push into the skin stretched the body's tolerance. Some would close their eyes, gritting their teeth as dozens of sharp points dotted their limbs. Others would whisper chants, praying that each piercing carried away the weight of illness. In the Mediterranean world, bronze carried the craft further. With metal, the needle became not only a tool for piercing, but for stitching. Wounds torn open by battle or accident could be drawn closed by thread guided through the skin. Imagine the process. The patient lying still, blood oozing slowly, while the healer takes a bronze needle, threads coarse fibre through its eye, and pushes it into torn flesh. The pain was unrelenting, each puncture sending waves of agony through an already broken body. The thread was rough, biting into skin as it was pulled tight, leaving behind thick scars that would last a lifetime. Yet the alternative was worse, the slow ebb of life from an open wound. The stitching of wounds became an art of necessity. Soldiers, travellers, farmers, anyone could fall victim to gashes that refused to heal without intervention. The needle, in such moments, became both tormentor and saviour. Each stitch was a cry, each knot a plea for survival. And when the final thread was tied, the wound pulled awkwardly together, there was silence. The healer's hands fell still, and all that remained was the hope that the body's strength would rise to meet the needle's work. But needles were not reserved only for mending. In some traditions, they became instruments of punishment disguised as cure. Physicians, bound by ancient theories of balance and humours, sometimes drove needles deep to draw out what they believed to be corrupted fluids. Small cuts or punctures were made deliberately, openings through which blood was forced to flow. patient sat pale and trembling as the needle's tip pierced again and again, leaving behind a constellation of tiny wounds meant to expel sickness. The skin became a map of suffering, dotted with the sharp kisses of bone or bronze. Even the act of piercing boils and abscesses carried its own cruel theatre. The swollen lump, taut and glistening, would be pricked with a sharpened tip, releasing its contents in a rush. The patient, writhing in both pain and disgust, was left with a wound that would bleed and ooze for days. To them, the needle was not an elegant tool, but a harsh reminder that to heal was to suffer first. And still, people submitted. They did so because they saw results, because the swelling lessened, because the bleeding slowed, because the wound, however painful, began to knit. In an age without choice, pain became the only currency through which life could be purchased. Over time, the image of the needle spread across cultures. In one land, it was a symbol of spiritual rebalancing. In another, a soldier's salvation. In another still, a physician's crude but necessary ally. Each culture shaped it to its own needs, yet the underlying truth remained the same. The needle pierced not just skin, but endurance itself. To imagine lying on a wooden table, body bound by others' hands, is to glimpse the experience. A bone or bronze point hovers above the flesh, glinting in firelight, then presses inward with slow, deliberate force. The skin resists, then yields, nerves igniting in protest. The body jerks, but is held down. The healer does not falter. They believe in the act, in the necessity of pain. Thread follows, pulling edges together. Another puncture, another pull. Time stretches. Each moment is an eternity of sharp agony, until at last the wound is closed. Relief does not come quickly. It comes only in silence, in the fragile chance of healing, in the faint hope that the body will forgive what has been done to it. Scars from these treatments often told their own stories. Thick, uneven lines across arms, legs, and torsos spoke of wounds stitched in desperation. Small pits across the skin marked where boils had been pierced, where blood had been drawn. Some scars were hidden beneath clothing, but others were carried openly, visible reminders of survival. They were not the neat signatures of modern surgery, but the raw handwriting of bone and bronze etched into human flesh. The legacy of these early needles is both haunting and profound. They remind us that medicine has never been gentle, that its roots are tangled with suffering. Each point pressed into the skin was an act of both violence and care. Each stitch was a negotiation between agony and survival. The needle, so small, carried within it the weight of life and death. And as centuries passed, it would remain, refined, reshaped, reimagined, but always the same at its core. A slender tool piercing flesh, bringing with it both the possibility of healing and the certainty of pain. In the quiet chambers of history, there was a time when illness was not seen as an invader from without, but as a swelling from within. To be sick was to be heavy, to be thick with imbalance, burdened by fluids that gathered and rotted inside the body. The cure, so many believed, was not to add, but to take away. And so, the practice of drawing blood began, not as an act of violence, though it was violent, but as a ritual of release. The body was thought to be ruled by humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, 4 forces woven into flesh and spirit. Too much of one, and the body faltered. Too little, and life slipped from its balance. Physicians, philosophers, and healers across continents looked upon the sick and saw a flood within them. To drain it was to restore harmony. To let blood spill was to lighten the weight of illness. Thus, the art of bloodletting was born. The act itself was deceptively simple. A blade, sharp and slender, pressed to the vein until it opened. A bowl waiting below, catching the warm flow as it spilled freely. The patient seated or lying, pale already from sickness, growing paler still as crimson life escaped drop by drop. To the healer, it was a necessary ritual. To the patient, it was weakness made visible, strength leaving the body in rivers. There was ceremony in the choice of where to cut. Physicians studied the map of veins as if it were a sacred text. The elbow crease, the wrist, the ankle, behind the ear, each spot connected, so they believed, to deeper currents within the body. A cut in one place could ease a fever. In another, it could calm madness. In yet another, it could cure pain of the stomach. To select wrongly was to risk death, but to choose rightly was to give the body a chance to heal. And so people submitted themselves to the blade. Kings and paupers alike stretched out their arms, wrists, or necks, allowing the physician's hand to press cold steel against skin. The sting was swift, the pain sharp but fleeting, and then the slow warmth of blood running free. Some fainted quickly, collapsing into darkness as the bowl filled. Others sat trembling, feeling their strength slip away with every drop. It was not always a single act. Sometimes bloodletting was repeated day after day, opening fresh wounds or reopening old ones. Fever might be answered with cups of blood drawn until the body was too weak to stand. Coughing, melancholy, even headaches, these too were treated by letting blood flow. Pain was constant, exhaustion overwhelming, yet patients endured, convinced that suffering was part of the cure. The tools varied. In early days, a simple blade sufficed, but soon instruments were crafted for the purpose. Lancets, small knives with pointed edges, gleamed in the light. Later came scarificators, devices fitted with rows of blades that could open the skin in a dozen places at once with a single press. The patient's skin was not cut, but shredded. A sudden bloom of red across the surface, followed by the steady drip of blood into waiting bowls. The agony was intense, the shock greater still. But to physicians, it was efficiency, a way to quicken the body's relief. There was also the art of cupping, where heated glass or metal cups were pressed to the skin, creating suction that drew blood to the surface. Some cups were applied after incisions, turning trickles into streams. Others were used on unbroken skin, raising welts that burst with a sharp prick of the blade. The patient lay beneath a forest of cups, body covered in red marks, pain spreading like fire across their back and limbs. For those who endured, there was always the promise that the worst was passing. The dizziness, the weakness, the trembling, these were signs, so it was said, that the body's burden was being lifted. But for many, the treatment carried them closer to death rather than away from it. Too much blood taken, and the body could not rise again. Too little, and the illness remained, returning with even greater force. The line was thin, walked by healers who held lives in their hands with every cut of the blade. And yet for centuries, bloodletting persisted. It was not only the poor who suffered its sting, but emperors, queens, generals, and saints. The belief was so strong that no rank could escape it. Monarchs were bled in gilded chambers, their blood flowing into silver bowls, while peasants were bled in dirt-floored cottages, their blood dripping onto clay. The setting changed, but the ritual remained the same. The opening of the vein, the slow escape of life, the hope that balance might be restored. Accounts from the past speak of physicians prescribing bloodletting for nearly every ailment. If fever gripped the body, open the vein. If madness clouded the mind, open the vein. If weakness overcame the limbs, open the vein. Even in childbirth, women were bled to calm the body, leaving them trembling and faint at the very moment life demanded their strength. Pain was the constant, a silent companion to the belief in cleansing. It was not only blades that brought this agony. In some places, leeches replaced steel. The small creatures, wriggling and alive, were placed upon the skin where they attached themselves with greedy mouths. The patient felt the first prick, then the slow pulling as blood was drawn out. Dozens might be applied at once, left to feed until they swelled with crimson fullness. Their removal left behind small wounds, still bleeding, still sore. To lie beneath a swarm of leeches, to feel them shifting and sucking, was a torment of its own. But it was accepted as a cousin of bloodletting, a softer but equally relentless drain. The philosophy of balance gave this practice its staying power. Physicians believed they were not merely cutting flesh, but adjusting the tides of life itself. And patients, desperate for relief, trusted in the blade. Even when fever did not break, even when strength dwindled, even when loved ones died after too much blood was taken, the belief endured. Pain was reimagined as proof of treatment, and scars became signs that the illness had been confronted. In dim, candlelit rooms, one can almost hear the rhythm of the practice, the scrape of blade against metal as it is sharpened, the hush of cloths laid out, the shallow breathing of the patient waiting for the sting. Then the cut, swift, deliberate, the soft patter of blood into a vessel, the physician's calm, steady gaze as the patient trembles, and finally the silence that follows, when the wound is bandaged and the patient lies pale and still, caught between relief and collapse. Centuries later, the practice would be questioned, but for much of human history, it was not just medicine, it was the medicine. To cut was to heal, to bleed was to live again. The pain of it was not cruelty but necessity, endured because there seemed no other way. The art of bloodletting leaves us with a haunting truth. Medicine has always been entwined with suffering. To heal, bodies were cut, drained, weakened and scarred. And though the bowls of blood have long since dried, though the lancets and cups now rest in museums, the memory of their sting lingers in the long shadow of history. There is something strangely quiet about water that does not move. A still pond, shaded by trees, its surface broken only by drifting leaves, hides a small darkness beneath. Among the reeds and mud at its edge, creatures stir slowly, gliding with patient certainty. Leeches. Small, soft, almost unnoticeable, yet for centuries they became instruments of healing and suffering. In the long silence of early medicine, when the body was thought to be governed by hidden balances and unseen humours, leeches were not pests. They were partners. To press one to the skin was to invite a slow drawing away of life's excess, a quiet draining believed to restore harmony. Where the sharp cut of a blade had once opened the flesh with sudden pain, leeches promised a gentler, though no less troubling, alternative. Their work was slow, deliberate, and often far more enduring than the patient wished. Imagine the dim interior of a healer's home, its air thick with herbs and dampness. A bowl of water sits nearby, and within it, small shapes move lazily, waiting. A patient, pale and fevered, lies upon a rough bed. The healer, with calm hands, reaches into the bowl and lifts one of the wriggling creatures. Its body is cold to the touch, supple, and almost fragile, but when placed upon the skin, it stirs to life, seeking warmth and blood. A subtle bite, no sharper than a pin, and then it clings, beginning its slow, unyielding meal. The patient lies still, perhaps shivering at the sensation. At first, there is only discomfort, a crawling unease at something alive fastened to the body. But as the leech swells, drawing mouthful by mouthful, the weight of its feeding becomes undeniable. Hours may pass before it releases, bloated, leaving behind a wound that bleeds stubbornly, sometimes far longer than intended. In this ritual, pain was not the flash of iron or fire. It was the quiet endurance of waiting, of feeling oneself drained, of watching the blood that was thought to carry sickness slip away into a creature's body. Leeches found their place in nearly every corner of history. In the temples of Greece, physicians of Hippocrates' tradition reached for them. In the markets of Rome, jars filled with writhing bodies were sold as remedies more precious than gold. Medieval doctors, with their heavy robes and solemn faces, saw in them a tool of divine order. And in the grand halls of the 19th century, where science claimed to rise above superstition, leeches still thrived. The scale was staggering. In France alone, during the height of their popularity, millions upon millions of leeches were imported each year. Vast wetlands were emptied of their populations to supply hospitals, noble houses, and battlefield tents. Patients of every class, rich and poor, soldier and scholar, found themselves marked by the round, reddened circles of leech bites. For fever, for headaches, for gout, for childbirth, even for melancholy of the spirit, leeches were summoned. The sight of them was not always met with fear. Some patients even believed in their quiet mercy, convincing themselves that the creature knew better than man where illness hid. But belief does not still the body's protests. The bites burned. The wounds bled longer than expected. Infections took hold. Sometimes a patient, weakened by the very excess of bleeding that was meant to cure, slipped closer to death. The line between healing and harm blurred, as it so often did in these stories of medicine's past. Picture again that still interior. A woman lies weak from childbirth, her body fragile, her blood already spent. The doctor applies leeches to draw away what he imagines as dangerous humours. She feels their weight clinging to her thighs and belly, their mouths pulling at her tender flesh. She is silent, too exhausted to protest. The leeches fall away only after they have swollen to grotesque size. The sheets beneath her are stained, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood. Was she cured? Or simply weakened beyond recovery? History does not always answer. And yet the faith in these small creatures endured. Napoleon's surgeons carried them into battle. Physicians in London's grand hospitals ordered them by the thousands. Even as needles of metal replaced bone and scalpels became more refined, leeches remained. Their presence spoke to something deeper than science, something about patience, about surrender, about the belief that suffering itself could be transformed into relief if endured long enough. The stillness of their work carried a strange symbolism. In an age when so much of medicine was loud with cries and clanging tools, leeches were quiet. They did not pierce with steel or scorch with fire. They waited, clung, and fed in silence. Perhaps it was this silence that lulled so many into trusting them. The patient endured the unease of a living parasite, yet found in its persistence a reflection of their own. Pain spread not in sharp flashes, but in long minutes that stretched into hours. It was the pain of time, of waiting for something inside the body to pass into another being. There is also the image of the countryside, where children wading through streams would emerge with leeches fastened to their legs. What was nuisance in play became treatment in medicine. Farmers and peasants knew their sting well, and yet in the healer's room, the same sensation was recast as cure. The boundary between ordinary life and the rituals of medicine blurred. What one brushed away in annoyance, another accepted in hope. Over time, suspicion grew. Not every patient improved, many weakened. Physicians debated, questioned, argued. Some insisted the problem was not the leech, but the physician who misused it. Others began to see that the body could not be endlessly drained without cost. But old habits die slowly. The jars of writhing creatures still lined the shelves of apothecaries, their dark forms swaying in water, awaiting the next call to service. Even now, their story lingers. In modern hospitals, sterile and bright, leeches have not vanished entirely. Surgeons sometimes return to them, not for the balancing of humours, but for their strange ability to restore circulation after delicate procedures. In the reattachment of a severed finger, in the fragile healing of skin grafts, leeches are summoned once more. Their ancient patience, their tireless feeding, can save what steel and fire cannot. Yet the memory of their past remains. For centuries, countless people lay still while the creatures did their work. They felt the tug at their skin, the trickle of blood, the weight of fatigue as strength slipped slowly away. Some lived to tell of relief, others never rose again. The story of leeches is not one of triumph, nor of simple failure. It is a reminder of the strange bargains people have made with nature in the search for healing. It is the story of endurance, of trust placed in silence, of pain that came not in shouts, but in long, quiet hours where the body yielded itself to the smallest of mouths. As we drift further, we leave behind the stillness of water and the soft, cold touch of these creatures. The world of medicine would continue to reach for sharper tools, harsher remedies, and stranger cures. Where leeches once drained blood drop by drop, other methods would rise, quicker, louder, but no less filled with suffering. And so the story moves onward, as the search for relief wandered deeper into shadows, where the line between healing and pain remained ever uncertain. There is a heaviness that settles over the thought of cutting into flesh, when there is no veil of forgetfulness to shield the mind. Today, the word surgery carries with it the promise of anaesthetic, an unseen drift into silence, a breath drawn through a mask, a needle slipping into the vein, and then nothing. But once, not so long ago, there was no such relief. The body remained awake, the mind remained awake, and the blade still fell. Before the age of chloroform, before ether, before the blessed fog of chemicals that quieted pain, the surgeon's work was performed in bright clarity. With every nerve alive, the patient was not spared a single sound, a single movement, a single moment. They heard the sharpening of knives. They smelled the smoke of heated irons. They saw the faces of those gathered around, holding them down. Their body became a battlefield in which the only weapon against agony was endurance. It was a theatre of both skill and speed. The surgeon's reputation depended on the swiftness of his hands, for every second saved was one less second of screaming. Amputations were measured in minutes, sometimes less, as saws bit through bone with practiced rhythm. Assistants pinned shoulders and legs to the table, their grip firm, their eyes avoiding the gaze of the patient beneath them. There was no comfort, only pressure, only the crushing weight of restraint. Imagine the air in such a room, the thick, sour scent of sweat, the copper tang of blood, the faint musk of straw strewn across the floor to catch what spilled. Outside, in crowded cities, curious onlookers sometimes pressed against windows to watch. In hospitals, students leaned close, notebooks in hand, faces pale as they tried not to tremble. The patient, pale already, trembled for them all. There were no soft beds to lie upon. The operating tables were often rough slabs, their surfaces scarred by the memory of other bodies, other knives. A patient laid upon such a surface would stare upward, heart pounding, as ropes or straps were tightened. Sometimes there were no straps at all, only the crushing hands of men whose duty it was to keep the body still, to prevent the thrashing that might ruin a surgeon's cut. The patient would struggle, of course. The body resists when bone is touched, when nerves scream, but the weight held them down. In these moments, the scream was not an outburst. It was a long companion. The voice strained and cracked, yet it kept on, echoing through halls and streets. Witnesses remembered such sounds long after. Some claimed the cries never left them, carried always at the edge of hearing. Others spoke of silence, of patients who bit down on leather straps or wooden sticks, enduring in a grim hush that unnerved all who listened. And yet, the surgeries continued. They had to. Wounds rotted, limbs blackened with gangrene, tumours swelled, bones shattered in accidents or war. To do nothing was certain death. To act was agony, but sometimes survival. This was the cruel balance of medicine, pain as the cost of life. On battlefields, the weight of surgery without sleep was multiplied 1,000-fold. Tents became theatres of desperation, lined with rows of men waiting their turn. The saws worked without pause. The knives never cooled. A soldier, dragged in from the mud, knew what awaited him before he reached the table. He had heard it already. The rasp of steel on bone, the muffled cries of those before him, the hurried prayers muttered between clenched teeth. The surgeon, exhausted, would glance at him only briefly, then begin. There was no time for comfort, no words of reassurance. Only the cut, the saw, the binding of wounds. The crushing weight was not only physical, it was also the weight of fear. Patients dreaded not only the blade, but the infection that followed. They knew too well the stories of wounds that festered, of fevers that burned hotter than fire, of deaths that came days later, slow and relentless. Many begged their surgeons to let them die rather than cut. Yet still, they were placed on the table, still the knives descended, because hope, fragile and faint, lingered. The surgeons themselves bore a different kind of weight. Their hands, quick and steady, carried lives with every motion. They learned to harden themselves against the cries, to shut out the pleading. Some even grew proud of their speed, boasting of amputations completed in under 2 minutes. But behind such pride was the knowledge of how much pain they caused, how much suffering passed beneath their hands. They carried it silently, as surely as the patient carried the scar. There are accounts of men fainting before the knife ever touched them, their minds retreating into darkness that their bodies could not escape. Some awoke to find themselves already bandaged, limb gone, their ordeal endured without memory. Others were not so fortunate. They remained conscious through every moment, each nerve alive, each sound etched into memory. A surgeon's saw striking bone is a noise unlike any other, a vibration felt as much as heard. For those who lay beneath it, the sound lingered in nightmares long after. The absence of sleep, of escape, of numbness, made surgery a realm of endurance that few could imagine today. To us, pain is something dulled, something managed, hidden behind walls of medicine. But for them, it was the central fact. Pain was not incidental to the cure. Pain was the cure, or at least the passage through which one had to travel to reach it. And still, there was silence after. The cries would fade. The struggling body would go limp, from exhaustion or from blood loss. The assistants would release their grip. The surgeon would bind the wound, sew the skin, wipe his instruments with a cloth that had seen 100 others. The room would smell of iron and sweat and smoke. And in that heavy air, there would be stillness. That stillness was not peace. It was the weight that lingered after the storm. The patient, if they lived, bore it in scars that never let them forget. The surgeons bore it in memory. The assistants bore it in the ache of arms that had restrained too many. The students bore it in notebooks stained by trembling hands. Everyone carried it, for surgery without sleep pressed itself into those who witnessed it as deeply as into those who endured it. And in this way, the story moved forward. Medicine, always searching, always testing, would not rest with knives alone. The hunger to ease this suffering drove men to experiment with gases, with vapours, with strange liquids that dulled the senses. It was in the face of such crushing weight that anesthesia was born, because humanity could not bear forever the sound of conscious cutting, the sight of eyes wide in terror, the endless grip of hands holding down the living. But before that moment arrived, before the blessed fog of sleep was given to the wounded, there were centuries of surgeries performed in the cruel brightness of wakefulness. Every cut was felt, every moment endured, every life saved carried the cost of unmeasured pain. And as we drift through this long shadow of history, we can almost hear it still, the steady rasp of saw on bone, the muffled cries beneath leather straps, the silence that followed as exhaustion gave way to uneasy survival. This was the crushing weight of surgery without sleep, a weight carried in flesh and in memory, in scars and in silence, pressing down across generations until at last the promise of forgetfulness lifted it away. There is a moment in the history of medicine where the knife was not the end, but only the beginning. Cutting into flesh left wounds open, raw, and vulnerable to the hidden rot of infection. And so another practice arose, one more brutal, more absolute, the burning of wounds shut, cauterization, the marriage of iron and fire to human skin. The sight must have been unforgettable. A brazier set glowing with coals, the hiss of bellows feeding air into the heat, and long rods of iron thrust into the heart of the flames until they glowed red, then white, with unbearable brilliance. The surgeon or healer lifted one out with tongs, the air around it shimmering, the metal singing with heat. The patient lay waiting, body trembling, already slick with sweat. There was no hope of relief, no hope of drifting away into silence, only the sure knowledge that fire was coming. The pain of a blade was sharp, immediate, and then it dulled into throbbing. But fire was different. Fire lingered. Fire consumed. The moment heated iron touched skin. There was a violent searing, a sound like meat spitting in a pan, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. The patient screamed, or sometimes did not, for the shock stole their voice. The body arched against the weight of assistants holding it down. Fingers clawed at wood, at fabric, at anything within reach. But the iron did not lift immediately. It was pressed down, held in place until the wound beneath was sealed, blackened, and closed to further bleeding. The pain was not only felt in the skin but deep within, carried along nerves, echoing through the mind in waves. When at last the iron was withdrawn, the wound was sealed, but the air was thick with smoke and the memory of agony. Cauterization was used for many reasons. A soldier struck by a blade might have his bleeding staunched with fire. A farmer with a festering wound might endure the iron in hopes of cutting rot away. Even teeth, when aching beyond endurance, were sometimes treated by placing heated instruments into the mouth. The cruelty of it was matched only by the desperation behind it, for in those times to do nothing was often to die, and so flesh was given to flame. Imagine the battlefield, where the cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of fire. Surgeons worked by the light of torches, plunging irons into braziers and pressing them against mangled limbs. Men already weakened by pain found themselves writhing again, their strength spent in screams. Some fainted before the iron touched them, their minds retreating into darkness. Others stayed conscious throughout, their cries carrying far into the night. The smell of war was not only gunpowder and blood, it was also the unmistakable stench of burning human flesh. In quieter places, the practice was no less terrible. In monasteries, where monks served as healers, cauterization was carried out with solemn ritual. Prayers whispered as irons heated, chants echoing against stone walls, the patient bound to prevent escape. Faith gave meaning to suffering, yet faith did not lessen pain. The body did not distinguish between holy fire and profane fire. It burned the same. The theory behind cauterization was as much symbolic as practical. Fire was purity, cleansing corruption. To burn a wound shut was to seal out evil humours, to drive away sickness, to prevent the hidden enemy of infection. It was also final. Where stitching failed, where herbs withered, fire endured. Flesh that had been burned would not easily open again. But the cost of such certainty was agony. Some accounts tell of patients begging for fire. The bleeding would not stop, the pain of an open wound unbearable. They asked for it, demanded it, knowing the torment to come. Others had to be forced, dragged or bound, their protest ignored for the sake of survival. The decision was rarely theirs to make. In the hands of the surgeon, the iron was destiny. Even kings and nobles were not spared. Monarchs wounded in battle or crippled by illness found themselves beneath the iron like any peasant. Their cries echoed in chambers hung with silk, just as the cries of commoners echoed in barns or huts. Fire was the great equalizer. No wealth, no power, no faith in divine favour could soften its bite. For some, the memory never left. Scars from cauterization were not only physical, but emotional. Men and women carried with them the smell of their own burning, the sight of smoke rising from their bodies. Dreams brought it back in vivid flashes, and waking moments carried a lingering fear of heat. The wound might have been sealed, but the experience was never closed. Still, cauterization saved lives. That was the terrible paradox. Many who endured the iron survived wounds that might otherwise have killed them. Infection, though not fully understood, was lessened by fire. Blood, once gushing freely, was stopped. The line between agony and salvation blurred, and so, despite its cruelty, the practice endured for centuries. Over time, new tools appeared, irons shaped into delicate forms for different parts of the body, heated knives that both cut and sealed in one motion, chemicals like oil of vitriol used to burn without flame. Yet the principle remained the same, to heal by burning. Each refinement changed the method, but not the essence. Flesh still yielded to fire, and patients still endured the terrible weight as heat was brought near. The ritual of cauterization often began long before the iron touched skin. The patient would watch as the brazier was lit, the coals stirred, the metal heated. The anticipation was its own torture, the body recoiling from what had not yet arrived. Time stretched unbearably in those moments. The patient's eyes fixed on the glowing rod, every heartbeat louder than the last, until at last the iron descended. In some ways, the waiting was as painful as the act itself, a slow, inevitable march toward agony. And yet, amid this cruelty, there was also a strange kind of faith. Faith that suffering itself was redemptive, that the cleansing of the body mirrored the cleansing of the soul. Some believed the burn carried away more than sickness. it carried away sin, weakness, corruption. Fire was both punishment and salvation, a divine touch disguised as pain. When we look back now, it seems almost unbearable to imagine. To place ourselves upon that rough table, to feel the grip of others holding us still, to hear the crackle of iron as it left the coals, to know that in moments it would meet our flesh. And then to endure the searing, the smoke, the scream that could not be swallowed. To survive, perhaps, but to be changed forever. As medicine advanced, the iron cooled, anaesthetics dulled the body, antiseptics cleansed wounds, and the flame was set aside. Yet even now, in remote places, cauterization lingers. In battlefield medicine, in emergencies far from hospitals, it has been called upon again. A soldier with no other chance, a traveller with no other option, still might feel the sear of fire closing a wound. The story of cauterization is not one of cruelty alone, but of necessity. It is a reminder that healing has never been separate from pain, that the road to survival was once lit by fire. The iron burned, and in burning, it both saved and scarred. The memory of that heat runs like a thread through the history of medicine, connecting the wounded of 1,000 years in their shared endurance. And so the tale moves on, from iron and flame to other cruelties dressed as cures. For every wound closed by fire, another was opened by different hands, in different ways. The search for healing carried humanity deeper into shadows, where pain remained the constant companion, and survival was purchased at the highest cost the body could pay. There is a strangeness in the thought of opening the skull, of peeling away the barrier between the world outside and the mind within. Flesh and bone guard the brain more fiercely than any fortress, and yet, across thousands of years, people chose to breach it with their tools. They did so not with the precision of modern drills or the quiet hum of machines, but with sharp stones, bronze knives, and iron chisels. Trepanning, the cutting or boring of holes into the skull, was one of the earliest and most enduring surgeries in human history. The idea of it alone stirs unease. To imagine lying on the earth, the sky wide above, while hands pressed your head still and a blade scraped bone, it is almost unbearable. Yet for many centuries, this was not only real, it was accepted. The pain of the body was nothing compared to the mysteries of the mind, and trepanning promised answers, or at least release. The earliest skulls tell their stories without words. Archaeologists have uncovered them in distant graves, ancient remains with perfect circles, or rough-edged openings carved into the bone. Some of these skulls show signs of healing, meaning the person lived long after the procedure. Others do not. The holes are their testimony, silent and enduring, to the willingness of humanity to endure suffering for the hope of relief. The reasons for trepanning were many. In some cases, it was to release spirits believed to dwell within, the invisible forces that brought madness, seizures, or unbearable headaches. To open the skull was to grant them an escape, a doorway through which the unseen tormentors might flee. In other cases, it was a treatment for injury, a way to relieve pressure from fractures or swelling after blows to the head. Between superstition and observation, the line was blurred, and in that blurred space, the practice took root. Imagine the moment itself. A patient sits or lies, their head shaved, the skin scraped clean. No anaesthetic exists, no soothing balm to dull what is coming. The healer holds a sharp stone or a bronze tool and begins to cut. The skin splits, blood flowing freely, dripping down into the patient's eyes. Assistants hold the head still, their hands firm against shoulders and arms. Then comes the sound, not the hiss of fire this time, not the rasp of saws through limbs. but the scraping of bone against metal. Slow, steady, unbearable. Each stroke shaves away a layer, each motion pressing vibrations deep into the skull. The pain is constant, relentless. The body strains, trying to twist away, but the hands holding it are stronger. The world grows narrow. Nothing exists but the blade, the scraping, the bone yielding bit by bit. The smell of bone dust mingles with sweat and blood, filling the air with a dry sharpness. Some patients faint, slipping into unconsciousness. Others stay awake throughout, their cries rising and falling with the rhythm of the tool. The healer works patiently, never rushing, for one careless strike could kill instantly. At last, the final layer is pierced. A hole opens. Sometimes it is small and neat, sometimes jagged. The pressure inside the skull eases, or so the healer believes. The wound is cleaned with wine, herbs, or whatever is at hand, then bound. The patient, if they live, carries a mark that will remain for life, an open window once carved into the fortress of their mind. The endurance of this practice is perhaps the most haunting part. It was not confined to one culture or one time. From the Andes to the plains of Africa, from Europe to Asia, trepanned skulls appear. It was as though humanity, in many places at once, discovered and accepted this most terrible remedy. Each culture gave it its own meaning, ritual, cure, offering, but the pain was the same, the blade scraping, the prayers whispered, the cries rising into air that seemed too wide and empty to contain them. There are accounts of trepanning used as part of spiritual rites, where the suffering itself was seen as a journey. Pain was not only endured, but sanctified. To have the skull opened was to step into another state of being, to come closer to gods or spirits. Those who survived bore their scars like sacred seals, proof that they had passed through the valley of agony and returned. And then there were the silent prayers. In the face of such torment, words failed. Patients begged silently, their lips moving without sound, or prayed inwardly to any power that might hear them. The healers too prayed that their hand would not slip, that the patient would endure, that the work of cutting into the most delicate of places would not end in death. The fear was not only in the moment of cutting, but in what came after. Infection stalked every wound, and the head was no exception. A patient might survive the ordeal only to fade days later, fever burning through the body, mind slipping into confusion until silence came. Families weighed this risk heavily. To choose trepanning was to gamble with agony and death against the faint hope of healing. And yet, over and over, the gamble was made. In time, the instruments grew more refined. Metal replaced stone, circular saws with handles replaced chisels, but the principle never changed. It was still the opening of the skull by hand, stroke after stroke, the patient beneath enduring. Even in the age of early modern medicine, trepanning persisted. Surgeons used it for head injuries, drilling into bone to relieve pressure, hoping that by carving into the skull they might save the brain beneath. The image of it lingers. A man seated in a surgeon's chair, his head held still. A steel trepan turned slowly, its teeth biting into bone. Each twist deeper, each sound sharper. Sweat pouring down his face, eyes wide with terror. No rest, no forgetting, only the long awareness of what is being done. The surgeon muttering reassurance that feels hollow, assistants pressing hands against the man's shoulders to keep him from jerking away. And then, at last, the final resistance gives way, and the circle of bone lifts free. Relief for the patient, if he lives long enough to feel it. Even now, There is something almost incomprehensible about this endurance. To allow another to open your skull while awake, to survive not only the cutting, but the weeks after. It is beyond what most could imagine. Yet countless did. Their skulls rest in museums, the neat circles staring back at us like silent witnesses. They speak without words, telling of lives lived in a world where pain was inseparable from healing, where the line between hope and horror was drawn across the very bones of the head. Trepanning has not vanished entirely. In modern hospitals, neurosurgeons still drill into skulls, though now with sterile tools, anesthetics, and precision unimaginable to the ancients. The principle, relieving pressure, giving space to a swelling brain, remains. But the experience is utterly changed. The patient sleeps, unaware, spared the scraping, the prayers, the silence of endurance. What remains is the history, the knowledge that once every step of the process was felt, endured, survived only by the strongest or the luckiest. In the long history of painful medicine, trepanning stands as one of the clearest reflections of humanity's strange relationship with suffering. It shows the lengths to which people would go for survival, the rituals they wrapped around agony to make it bearable, the prayers whispered in silence when words could not reach. It is not a story of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but of desperation, of hope, and of the terrible price paid for even the faintest chance at life. As we drift forward, the sound of scraping bone fades into memory, and the smoke of fire, the weight of knives, the grip of leeches all gather behind us. Yet the story does not grow lighter. It continues, carrying us into other chambers where bodies lay bound, where tools glinted in dim light, where pain was the companion of every cure. The journey through the history of healing remains a journey through shadows, where the line between salvation and torment was as thin as a circle carved in bone. The body is a fragile map, and when one part of it is lost to rot, infection, or shattered bone, the choice becomes merciless. Keep the dying limb and risk the whole, or cut it away and hope that life can continue. Few decisions were as cruel, and few treatments carried such a weight of dread as amputation. For centuries, it was the last resort, a measure taken when nothing else remained, and it was done in a world where the patient was fully awake, fully aware, and utterly helpless. The word itself, amputation, suggests clean removal, but there was little cleanliness in those early days. The surgeon's hands were steady, but his tools were crude. Iron knives, cleavers, saws, sometimes sharpened on stones, moments before they met flesh. The patient was tied down, not only to protect the surgeon's work, but to protect himself from thrashing against the agony. A wooden rod might be pressed between his teeth, a last attempt to keep the screams contained. The stillness before the cut was the most unbearable. Patients knew what was coming. They had often begged for any alternative, any other treatment, but by the time amputation was chosen, there was no turning back. Gangrene crept like a shadow through the limb, the stench of decay spreading with it. A festering wound from battle or accident left no mercy. It was death of the part, or death of the whole. And so they submitted, though their eyes told of terror that words could not carry. When the blade touched skin, the world narrowed. The first cut was deep, fast, dragging a line through a flesh that gaped open in red folds. Assistants held the patient down, their muscles straining against his wild thrashing. The surgeon moved quickly, not only to lessen suffering, but to stay ahead of the body's collapse. Blood poured in sheets, soaking rags, spilling onto the floor. There was no delicate stitching here, not yet. The focus was on severing, separating, finishing the grim task before shock overcame the patient. Saw against bone was the next sound, and it was unforgettable. The rasping scrape, the vibration that travelled through the whole body, the grinding that spoke of separation. Each push and pull of the saw tore deeper, the patient jerking in agony, teeth clenched so tight the jaw threatened to break. The smell of it was thick, blood and marrow, iron and sweat. The assistants pressed harder, sometimes murmuring words of comfort that felt powerless against the storm. At last, with a final wrench, the limb was free. It fell away, lifeless, sometimes landing with a heavy thud beside the table. The surgeon's work, however, was not done. Arteries had to be tied, vessels clamped with crude ligatures to keep life from flowing out entirely. Fire might be used, hot irons pressed to the raw wound, cauterizing with smoke and searing heat. The screams that followed were like no others, pulled from the deepest chambers of suffering. Yet if the patient survived this moment, there was a chance, a fragile, wavering chance, that life might continue. Survival was not guaranteed. The loss of blood, the shock to the body, the endless risk of infection, all hovered close. Many slipped away quietly hours later, their breathing shallow until it ceased. Those who lived bore their scars as permanent companions. The stump was bound in rough cloth, painful and swollen for weeks. Phantom pains haunted them, sensations of limbs no longer there, reminders of what had been taken. In villages and battlefields alike, amputees became living testaments to medicine's harshest edge. Sometimes healing meant not saving, but cutting away. The practice of amputation is as old as recorded medicine, and it grew alongside war. On battlefields, where cannon fire shattered bone and swords carved deep, amputation was often the only path to survival. Surgeons worked in tents or open fields, their instruments washed in little more than cold water, if at all. Rows of men awaited their turn, each knowing that screams ahead foretold what was to come. The ground was littered with severed arms and legs, the grim harvest of survival. Soldiers spoke of the smell, a mixture of blood, rot and smoke that clung to the air for miles. Speed became the surgeon's greatest skill. Some could remove a limb in under 2 minutes, the blade flashing, the saw rasping, the assistants binding and cauterizing in a blur of motion. To the patient, those minutes stretched into eternity, each second an ocean of fire. Yet speed meant survival, for the longer the body endured, the more likely shock or blood loss would overwhelm. Surgeons became known not by their gentleness but by their swiftness. Their names carried in whispers of respect and dread alike. Even in quieter settings, away from battle, amputations took place in dim rooms with crude tables. A farmer whose leg was crushed beneath a cart, a child whose hand festered from infection, a labourer torn by machinery. All faced the same fate. There was no escape, no mercy. Families gathered outside, listening to cries that seemed to stretch time itself, praying that the voice would not fall silent too soon. Inside, the surgeon's face was calm, practiced, unmoved by the suffering. He had seen it too often. His hands did not tremble. They could not afford to. And still, for all its cruelty, amputation was not senseless. It was often the only reason some lived when death seemed certain. The price was unbearable pain and lifelong loss, but it was a price some were willing to pay. And across centuries, across cultures, it remained a treatment of last resort, a grim reminder that healing often meant sacrifice. It was not until the age of anesthetics that the experience changed. With the discovery of chloroform and ether, patients could finally be made to sleep through the ordeal. For the first time, a body lay still, not because it was bound, but because it was unconscious. Surgeons could work with less haste, more precision, their ears no longer filled with cries. But this was centuries away from those who endured the cold embrace of the saw awake. For them, there was only the strap across the chest, the rod in the teeth, and the unrelenting fire of each cut. The memory of it lingers in the stories of soldiers, in letters written by survivors, in accounts passed down from family to family. Men spoke of watching comrades lose their limbs, of hearing their screams in the night long after the wounds had healed. Some wore their scars with pride, evidence of survival. Others sank into silence, carrying the weight of loss too heavy for words. And in the shadow of it all, there was always the choice to submit, to endure, to gamble life against pain. It was a choice made countless times, under countless skies, with the smell of blood heavy in the air, and prayers whispered into the noise of saw and scream. In the quiet hours of history, amputation stands as both a triumph and a torment. It speaks of the desperation of those who faced it, the steadiness of those who performed it, and the endless resilience of the human body and spirit. To be cut apart and yet continue, that was survival at its rawest. And though it came with agony, it also came with the faintest flicker of hope. The image remains: a dim room, a body bound, a blade poised above trembling flesh. The first cut begins, and with it the world contracts to pain and survival. In that space, the line between life and death was not marked by breath or heartbeat, but by the steady, merciless sound of a saw cutting through bone. And so the story moves forward, carrying with it the echoes of those cries, the stillness that followed, and the truth that healing in ages past was a road paved in suffering. The body has many ways of reminding us of its fragility, and few are as relentless as pain born deep within the mouth. A tooth, when diseased, throbs with a rhythm all its own, an insistent beat that robs sleep, scatters thought, and makes every swallow an agony. Long before dentistry became a profession, before numbing agents and delicate drills, there was only the simplest answer: remove the tooth, no matter the cost. The setting was rarely a place of comfort. Often it was a dim corner of a home, a stall in a marketplace, or a shadowed room behind a tavern. Light came from a wavering candle or a single window. The patient sat on a stool or rough chair, their hands gripping the wood until knuckles blanched. There was no polished chair that reclined, no sterile cloth laid over the chest. Only the weight of dread and the sharp awareness of what was about to happen. The tools were crude, sometimes nothing more than pliers forged for another task, or iron tongs blackened with use. Some who claimed the skill of tooth pulling carried with them hooks, chisels, or even sharpened nails bent into makeshift instruments. In the hands of a barber surgeon, a blacksmith, or a travelling charlatan, these tools promised relief, but they carried with them a storm of pain that few could ever forget. The process was simple in word, but brutal in execution. The mouth was forced open, often with hands prying against lips and jaw. The instrument found its place around the tooth, clamping with an unforgiving grip. There was no pause for gentleness, for soothing words or careful adjustments. Once the tool was in place, it was turned, wrenched, and pulled with violent force. The first motion was always the worst. Roots anchored deep into bone resisted fiercely, tearing at gum and jaw as they were twisted. Pain radiated through the skull, a searing bolt that blinded and deafened all at once. The patient's cries filled the room, echoing against stone or wood, muffled only by the thick hand of an assistant pressing against their chest to hold them still. Blood poured into the mouth, bitter and metallic, mixing with spit until it spilled down the chin. Sometimes the tooth gave way quickly, snapping free with a sickening crack, leaving behind a hollow pit that bled and throbbed. Other times it shattered, breaking into jagged fragments that the puller had to dig out piece by piece, each attempt more excruciating than the last. The gums tore, the jaw ached, and the screams grew hoarse until they dwindled into sobs. Relief was never clean. It was messy, violent, and drenched in blood. And yet, when the tooth was finally gone, there was silence. The relentless throb that had ruled every moment of the patient's life ceased, replaced by the dull ache of a wound. It was not peace, not truly, but it was a shift, a trade of torment for exhaustion. Many slumped in their chairs afterward, trembling, sweat-soaked, whispering thanks through lips still shaking. The practice of tooth-pulling carried its own theatre. In bustling squares, itinerant tooth drawers set up small stages, calling out to passers-by, promising to rid them of their pain. Crowds gathered, eager to witness the spectacle. A man sat in the chair. The puller raised his tools with a flourish, and in moments the air filled with cries and gasps. When the tooth came free, it was held aloft triumphantly, shown to the crowd as proof of success. Applause mingled with pity, and the puller pocketed his fee. Pain in these moments became public entertainment. But not all extractions were so controlled. In remote villages, where no surgeon passed, family members took on the task themselves. A husband pulling the tooth of his wife with a piece of twine, a father using a dagger to pry loose a rotted molar from his child's mouth. These moments were raw and desperate, driven by love and necessity, yet no less filled with screams. The intimacy of such acts etched them into memory. The face of a loved one above, the agony of the act below, forever joined in the mind of the sufferer. There were those who sought to dull the pain in their own ways. Strong drink was poured down throats until the edges of consciousness blurred. Herbal mixtures, chewed or smeared along the gums, brought fleeting numbness. But none could fully silence the nerve's cry. The tooth always screamed louder until steel answered it. The aftermath was its own ordeal. Wounds festered in mouths uncleaned, infections creeping into jaw and throat. Swelling turned cheeks into grotesque shapes, fevers burned, and sometimes death followed days later, quiet and merciless. To survive a tooth pulling was no guarantee of safety, only a crossing into another kind of trial. And yet, people lined up. They lined up because the pain of a rotting tooth was unbearable, more consuming than almost any other. It robbed the body of rest, the mind of peace. To trade that agony for a moment of torment at the hands of a puller was a gamble they took willingly, even with all the risks. As centuries moved on, the art of dentistry emerged slowly, but in those darker ages, tooth pulling remained a shadowed craft, practiced wherever pain forced the desperate to seek relief. It was not science, but necessity. Not gentleness, but force. Each extraction was its own battle, a struggle between the body's resistance and the iron will of the one who held the tool. The memory of it lingers in old writings, in paintings of bustling squares where surgeons brandished teeth like trophies, in whispered stories of ancestors who endured. The image is stark. A darkened room, a patient trembling, the flicker of a candle casting shadows across iron tools. The puller leans close, grips tight, and with a violent wrench, pain bursts into a final crescendo before silence takes its place. It was, in its own way, a mercy, a cruel, blood-soaked mercy. For in a time when pain could hollow a life into misery, the pulling of teeth, even in the darkest of rooms, was one of the few paths to relief. Pain has never only come from knives or flame. Sometimes it arrives more quietly, poured from a cup, swallowed with trust, or rubbed gently into the skin. There was a time when healing was thought to live in metals and minerals, substances pulled from the earth and pressed into service against disease. Among them, none was used so often, or with such tragic faith, as mercury. It gleamed like liquid silver, flowing in the palm without smoke or spark. To the eye, it seemed almost otherworldly, alive, moving where no water should move. Healers saw in it a purity, a strange gift of nature. They believed it could scour illness from within, burn away corruption, or draw out the hidden causes of suffering. And so mercury became medicine, a cure whispered across empires, from apothecaries in Europe to physicians in China and India. Its touch was cold, but its promise was warmth and restoration. The promise, however, was never gentle. To swallow mercury was to invite a storm into the body. Patients were given draughts of it, thick and heavy on the tongue, sliding down the throat with a metallic bitterness that clung to every breath. Within hours, the stomach convulsed, bowels loosened, sweat poured in torrents. Physicians looked upon these agonies not as warning, but as proof. The body was purging, cleansing itself, driving sickness outward. In truth, it was poison at work, spreading quietly, tearing at organs, leaving destruction in its wake. Those treated with mercury often grew thin, their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, their breath heavy with the unmistakable metallic scent. Their skin trembled, their hands shook, their minds clouded with confusion. Yet the treatments continued, dose after dose, as if more poison could wash away what poison had already begun. Families watched as loved ones withered, caught in the slow grip of a cure that was itself a disease. It was not only swallowed, mercury was also rubbed into the flesh, especially as a balm against the torment of syphilis, a disease feared as both punishment and plague. The ointments were spread thick across the skin, seeping into pores, burning with an invisible fire. Patients endured night after night, wrapped in blankets, sweat pouring as the metal sank deeper. The treatment lasted weeks, sometimes months. A night in the arms of Venus, it was said, and a lifetime in the arms of Mercury. Those who endured often found the disease no less persistent, while their bodies carried the permanent scars of poisoning. Other poisons joined mercury in this grim apothecary. Arsenic was given in powders, its bitterness masked in wine or mixed with herbs. Physicians believed it could sharpen appetite, banish fever, or even restore vigour to the weak. In small amounts it seemed to help, for the body fought the poison with a resilience that gave the illusion of healing. But over time, the skin grew pale, the nails brittle, the heart unsteady. Hair fell away in clumps, sores opened across the body, and pain lingered like a shadow that could not be driven out. Antimony, too, found its place in the cabinet of cures. Made into emetics, it was swallowed to summon vomiting, to force the body into violent rejection of illness. The patient knelt or collapsed, their insides twisting, retching until they were emptied of everything but exhaustion. Physicians nodded with satisfaction, certain the poison had done its work. But the body, battered by such cruelty, often never fully recovered. There were stranger brews still. Lead was mixed into sweet powders, used to calm stomachs and coat throats. Copper salts burned away growths and infections, leaving raw flesh behind. Even gold, powdered and suspended in liquids, was prescribed to those thought to suffer from melancholy or weakness, as if the brilliance of the metal could somehow pass into the veins. Every sip, every dose, was an experiment upon the human body. And yet, these substances were not given in malice. They were offered with hope, with the same earnestness that led healers to cut, to burn, to bleed. Pain was seen as proof, as a sign that medicine was working, that the sickness was being forced to retreat. The line between cure and suffering blurred until it was no line at all, only a slow descent into weakness disguised as treatment. In the dim chambers of apothecaries, shelves groaned with jars and bottles, powders and oils. Families came with coins clenched tightly, desperate for remedies against fevers, coughs, and wasting diseases. They left with packets of powders, vials of shimmering liquid, instructions to swallow, to apply, to endure. The rooms filled with the smell of minerals ground fine, the metallic tang of mercury rising like a ghost from mortar and pestle. The sound of pestles striking echoed like a drumbeat of faith, each measure promising salvation. The suffering that followed was not swift, but lingering. Children wasted away slowly under treatments meant to strengthen them. The elderly trembled as their bodies betrayed them. Men and women alike found their lives shortened, not by the disease alone, but by the cure meant to banish it. And through it all, the world continued to believe, for without alternatives, the hand that held the poison was also the hand that offered hope. Even in palaces, among kings and emperors, mercury and poison held sway. Monarchs were dosed with it to prolong their lives, their bodies quietly unravelling beneath fine robes. Courtiers whispered of the strange pallor of their rulers, of teeth falling from once proud mouths, of tremors in hands that once signed decrees with authority. Power could not shield against poison disguised as medicine. The suffering of the mighty mirrored that of the commoner, bound by the same faith in a cure that betrayed them. The slow grip of mercury did not only wound the body, it touched the mind as well. Patients lost themselves in confusion, their thoughts tangled, their speech broken. What began as treatment ended in madness, yet physicians interpreted it as the disease's hold rather than the cure's cruelty. Families watched loved ones slip away, unable to name the true cause, trapped in a silence where only pain remained certain. And yet, despite its cruelty, mercury endured for centuries. It crossed cultures, languages, and generations, always returning as a remedy too strange to abandon. Even as evidence of its harm grew, the faith in its power clung tightly. It was not until much later, with the slow rise of chemical science and the careful eye of experiment, that mercury's mask as a healer began to slip away. But by then, countless lives had already been shaped by its touch. The story of poison in medicine is not one of malice, but of desperation, of trust placed in the earth's hidden gifts without knowledge of their shadows. It is a reminder that the path of healing has often been a road of suffering, paved not with gentle remedies, but with substances that tore at the body even as they promised relief. In the stillness of memory, one can almost see the scene: a candlelit chamber, a patient hunched over a cup, swallowing liquid silver with trembling hands. The taste is sharp, metallic, unyielding. Hours later, sweat pours, the body convulses, the mind begins to drift. The healer stands nearby, murmuring that the cure is working, while in truth, the poison tightens its slow grip. And so history moves on, carrying with it the echoes of these treatments, the quiet suffering of those who endured them, and the lesson that healing has never been free from pain. The earth gave its metals, its minerals, its poisons and humanity, in its endless search for relief, took them in, never fully understanding that sometimes the cure was a shadow darker than the sickness itself. The human body has long been the subject of pain in the pursuit of healing, but there is another kind of suffering that history remembers, one less about flesh and more about the mind, where fevers and wounds could be seen and touched. The mysteries of madness left healers groping in shadow. And in those shadows, the cure often took the shape of iron, wood, and rope. For centuries, those who lost themselves to visions, voices, or violent fits were thought to be caught between worlds, their minds unmoored from reason. Families, unable to understand or endure the turmoil, brought them to places said to hold answers. The asylums, the hospitals, the locked wards where chains clinked louder than any prayer. To step inside such places was not to find comfort, but to enter a realm where restraint itself was considered a form of medicine. The cure was simple in appearance: bind the body, contain the spirit, prevent harm by surrendering freedom. Patients were shackled to walls, their wrists bound in iron cuffs, their ankles tethered to bolts driven deep into stone. Others were confined in narrow cells, where the only sound was their own voice, echoing back at them, unanswered. Healers believed that stillness could quiet the storm of madness, that restraint would force calm where reason could not. Yet stillness was not what the body felt. The iron bit into skin, leaving bruises that darkened into open sores. The weight of chains bent the spine, made limbs stiff, made breath shallow. Days blurred into nights, the body aching from immobility, the mind spinning deeper into despair. The treatment was not swift pain, like the cut of a blade, but a slow crushing, as if the walls themselves pressed inward hour by hour. In some places, the restraint took the form of the tranquilizer chair, an invention that promised to soothe through immobility. The patient was strapped into a high-back seat, arms and legs bound tightly, the head fixed in place. A box or hood might be placed over the skull, muffling sound, closing out light. For hours, sometimes for entire days, they remained there, motionless, silent, forced into stillness. Physicians watched with calm assurance, believing that quieting the senses would quiet the mind. For the patient, however, the silence was deafening, the weight of their own body unbearable, the treatment a kind of waking burial. Water, too, was used as a tool of control. Cold baths were prescribed, the patient plunged into icy water to shock the mind into clarity. Some were left to float in tubs for hours, their skin wrinkling, their teeth chattering. Others endured the spinning chair, a contraption where the patient was strapped in and rotated rapidly, the world blurring until dizziness gave way to vomiting and collapse. To the healer, this disorientation was a method, a way to reset the mind. To the one enduring it, it was terror disguised as cure. There were also the restraining garments, heavy with buckles and straps. A patient wrapped within could not move their arms, could barely shift their body. The fabric pressed tightly against the chest, the skin burning beneath its constant grip. Left for hours, for days, the garment became not protection, but punishment. Limbs weakened from disuse, muscles ached with cramps, and the sense of self eroded under the weight of enforced helplessness. Yet perhaps the deepest suffering came not from the iron or cloth, but from isolation itself. Madness was not met with words or comfort, but with walls and locks. Those confined spent years in dim cells, their companions the echoes of their own thoughts. Meals slid through narrow openings, contact reduced to brief moments with silent warders. The cure for madness was, in truth, the slow unravelling of identity. In the silence, the mind frayed further, until the person within was little more than a shadow. The treatments reflected not cruelty for its own sake, but a belief rooted in fear. Madness was seen as dangerous, unpredictable, contagious in its way. Restraint was thought to protect both patient and society, to guard against violence or shame. And so families consented, communities approved, and physicians prescribed what seemed to be the only path. The suffering that followed was not hidden, but accepted, absorbed into the rhythm of everyday life. And within this rhythm, stories whispered through the halls, of patients whose cries could be heard across stone walls, rising each night as the chains cut deeper, of those who sat in chairs unmoving for so long their muscles wasted away, of others who begged for release, not from madness, but from the weight of the cure itself. These voices were seldom recorded, for history more often remembers the healers than the healed. Yet they linger, faint echoes in the corridors of memory. Even the wealthy were not spared. Nobles, princes and scholars found themselves subject to the same restraints, their learning or status unable to shield them from the cure of iron. Madness did not discriminate, and neither did the treatments. In quiet rooms of grand estates, private cells were built, chains fastened, garments tightened. Servants stood as warders, families as witnesses, all believing that this suffering was a step toward restoration. There were moments, rare but remembered, when a calmer vision of treatment emerged. Some physicians advocated for gardens, for fresh air, for gentle work with hands and soil. But these voices were few, and their practices fragile against the weight of tradition. The clink of chains drowned out softer cures, and restraint remained the language of healing for centuries. The pain of these treatments was not always visible. Unlike the blade that cut flesh, or the fire that seared skin, this was a slower torment, hidden in the quiet of locked rooms. The patient's cries might fade, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion, surrender, the body giving in to what it could not resist. And so the history of madness is also the history of restraint. Chains that grew rusted with use, chairs worn smooth by countless bodies, garments stained with the sweat of long confinement. Each piece of iron, each strip of cloth, carried the memory of lives pressed into submission. They were not simply tools but witnesses, bearing silent testimony to the suffering they enforced. What is striking, when looking back, is the absence of malice. Those who fastened chains did so with conviction, believing themselves to be healers, protectors, even saviours. The cruelty lay not in their intent, but in their ignorance, in the narrowness of understanding that equated control with cure. It is a reminder that suffering in the name of medicine has not always been inflicted with a sneer, but with a steady hand and a quiet voice, assuring that this was for the best. The story does not end quickly, for chains and restraints lingered into the modern age. Long after new ideas began to stir, patients still found themselves bound, still felt the cold iron on their skin. Only slowly did the world begin to turn, to imagine treatments rooted not in restraint, but in compassion. Yet even as progress crept forward, the memory of centuries remained, a heavy shadow stretching behind every locked door. One can almost picture the scene, a dim ward at dusk, a single candle flickering against the stone. A patient lies in a narrow bed, arms strapped, chest bound, the weight of fabric pressing down with every breath. Across the hall, another sits in a chair, head bowed under a wooden hood, the silence so deep it seems eternal. Somewhere nearby, chains scrape faintly against stone as a restless figure shifts in the darkness. The healers move quietly among them, convinced that stillness will bring peace. But the peace never comes. What remains is endurance, the body holding on against the slow passage of time, the mind wandering between despair and resignation. And history, watching from a distance, carries these images forward, reminders of how pain once masqueraded as medicine. The cure for madness, as it was once understood, was not found in words, nor in kindness, but in the unyielding grip of restraint. It was a cure that never healed, but one that shaped centuries of human suffering. And in its shadow, the story of medicine continues, marked by chains that once promised salvation, but delivered only silence. The body has always been shaped by extremes, of fire, of iron, of restraint. But another element haunted the history of healing, water, in its coldest, most punishing form. Where flame once sealed wounds and chains once held restless limbs, ice and water came forward as instruments of cure, wielded not for refreshment or cleansing, but for control. To those who believed in its powers, water was both punishment and salvation, a way of breaking the fevered mind and bending it back toward obedience. Physicians and warders alike leaned upon its chill to still the body, to jolt the soul, to drown out the chaos of thoughts. And for those who endured it, the cure came as waves of shivering, teeth chattering, muscles locked in cramps, the marrow itself seeming to freeze with pain. Cold baths became a language of medicine. Patients were lowered into tubs filled with water, drawn straight from wells or rivers, icy and sharp against bare skin. They were left there for long stretches, sometimes for hours, the body trembling uncontrollably, the breath shallow. The belief was simple: shock the system, cool the fire within, press the fevered spirit into quiet submission. But the chill did not heal. It carved through muscle, stiffened joints, left lips blue and pulses faint. In some wards, patients were wrapped in sheets, soaked through with freezing water. The cloth clung tightly, heavy as it dried against their skin. At first, the shock would steal the breath. Then the body settled into a slow agony of numbness. Immobility set in, not from restraint, but from the sheer weight of cold pressing into bone. Physicians observed carefully, waiting for the struggle to fade into stillness, convinced that the cure was at work. Yet what remained was exhaustion, the kind that hollowed the body and blurred the edges of thought. There were more violent versions too. Buckets of icy water poured suddenly over the head, drenching clothes, soaking skin, striking the chest like a hammer. Or patients thrust beneath streams until they gasped and sputtered, the shock rippling through them as though life itself might be jolted back into order. The body reacted with terror, the heart racing, the lungs struggling, the skin burning from cold, as if scalded by its opposite twin. To the healer, this was a test of endurance, a cleansing. To the patient, it was suffocation disguised as treatment. But water was not only cold, it could also spin, swirl, disorient. The spinning chair, so often paired with water's force, was a device of peculiar cruelty. A patient strapped firmly into its seat would be rotated with increasing speed, the world turning to blur, the body fighting to keep hold of itself. The dizziness overwhelmed, nausea rose, and collapse often followed. Some physicians even believed that vomiting was proof the mind had been reset, as if emptying the stomach might empty the madness. These treatments were not confined to the margins of history. Across Europe and beyond, asylums echoed with the sound of splashing water, of wooden buckets dragged across stone floors, of groans carried on the damp air. Records note how patients were cooled in midwinter baths, their shivering bodies lifted from water, only to be wrapped again in wet cloths, left by open windows where the air itself was an accomplice to the cure. The seasons did not shield them. Indeed, the colder the better, for shock was the point, not comfort. It is striking to imagine the nights when this unfolded. Picture a stone corridor, lanterns burning faintly, warders carrying pails of water that steamed in the candlelight, not because it was hot, but because the air itself was colder still. Patients roused from uneasy sleep, their protests ignored, bodies stripped and plunged into baths that robbed them of warmth in seconds. The sound of water sloshing against stone walls mingled with shivers and sobs, all of it recorded in silence as part of medicine's ritual. The idea of shock extended beyond water into electricity, though in its earliest forms it was clumsy and uncertain. Before machines refined its force, rudimentary attempts to pass current through the body were paired with immersion, amplifying the terror of both. A patient half submerged might feel the prickle of unnatural current across their skin, the muscles contracting violently, the mind overwhelmed by sensations it could not name. These were not the precise therapies of later centuries, but crude experiments, where suffering itself was measured as proof of effectiveness. Shock, whether by ice or by current, was never gentle. It was a cure that demanded submission, that sought not to soothe, but to overwhelm. The patient was left weakened, trembling, spirit dulled by exhaustion. For some, the after effects lingered in aching joints, in fevers born of exposure, in lungs that rasped from chilled air. Yet physicians, watching from the edge, recorded calm notes. The patient subdued, the fit less violent, the will broken. In their eyes, the cure was working. But beyond the clinical notes lay the quiet truth of human endurance. Each shiver was a measure of survival, each breath against the cold, a struggle not against madness but against the cure itself. The body was forced to its edge, then left to find its way back, over and over, until exhaustion became indistinguishable from healing. The forgotten shock of water lingers in memory, not because it was rare, but because it was common. Too common to be remarked upon at length, too ordinary to spark outrage. It was routine, accepted, folded into the daily rhythm of treatment. The patient's suffering did not stand out. It became the background, as constant as the walls around them. And so it is remembered faintly, a whisper carried forwards, less dramatic than fire or blade, but no less cruel. Even outside the walls of asylums, water carried its reputation as cure. Folk traditions used cold streams to wash away spirits, plunging the troubled beneath the surface until they gasped for air. Villages held their own rituals of shock, believing that madness could be drowned out by rivers, lakes, or wells. These practices were not seen as punishment, but as care, a desperate attempt to restore balance through nature's most elemental force. Yet for those who endured them, the memory was the same. The suffocating grip of cold, the terror of breath stolen away. Time moved forward, and with it, ideas shifted. Gardens replaced chains, words replaced silence, and new sciences began to stir. But the memory of cold water lingered in the walls of asylums, in the dampness of stone cells, in the stains of sheets once soaked through. Even as more compassionate visions of treatment grew, buckets of water still stood ready, tubs still filled, shock still awaited the patient whose mind refused to bend. The cruelty was never in the element itself. Water, after all, sustains life, quenches thirst, cleanses the body. Ice preserves, refreshes, calms the fevered brow when placed with care. But when wielded as cure, stripped of gentleness, these same gifts became punishments. It was not water that tormented, but the hand that forced it, the mind that declared suffering to be medicine. One can almost hear it still, the drip of water from a soaked garment onto stone, the slow creak of a chair spinning in the half-dark, the chattering of teeth echoing through empty halls. These sounds fade into silence, but the memory persists, carried forward not as triumph, but as caution. And in that silence, the story continues, for medicine has always searched in shadows, grasping at cures that wound as much as they heal. Ice, water, shock. Each carried its promise, each left its mark. Together they form another chapter in the long tale of human endurance, a tale where suffering became a prescription and survival itself was counted as success. The search for relief from suffering often carried humanity into places where silence was heavier than sound. In the long centuries when pestilence moved like a shadow across towns and cities, medicine wrapped itself in mystery and disguise. The figure of the plague doctor emerged, cloaked and masked, stepping into rooms where others dared not linger. These rooms, filled with the breath of the dying, became stages where healing and fear entwined, where remedies promised safety but delivered new agonies. The costume itself told the story of terror. A wide-brimmed hat, a long coat of waxed fabric or leather, gloves that sealed the hands, and most striking of all, the mask, its beak stretching outward like a bird of omen. Within the hollow beak, herbs and spices were packed, thought to cleanse the air, to filter out the miasma believed to carry death. The scent of lavender, rosemary or cloves filled the narrow space between doctor and patient, but beyond the mask's safety, the air was thick with disease. Those who wore this garb moved slowly, methodically, through rooms where families huddled or lay sprawled in fever. They carried sticks to prod at bodies, to keep distance, to guide the sick without touch. In their hands also were instruments of crude medicine, knives, cautery irons, and cups for bleeding. They were not healers in the gentle sense, but guardians of ritual, applying treatments that clung to old beliefs, even as plague swept unbroken across continents. The silence of these rooms was often broken only by coughs, by groans muffled under blankets, by the whisper of the doctor's coat brushing against stone floors. Remedies offered there were as painful as the illness itself. Bleeding was common, veins opened with quick cuts, blood drawn out into bowls, in the belief that the sickness would flow with it. Already weak bodies trembled, lips pale, yet the ritual continued, the pain folded into the rhythm of cure. Cauterization followed, the iron heated until it glowed, pressed against swollen swellings or abscesses that marked the plague's progress. The hiss of flesh meeting fire mingled with cries that echoed faintly in the shuttered houses. The doctor, face hidden by glass and beak, remained unmoved, convinced that sealing the wound meant sealing the sickness within. For the patient, it was fire-consuming flesh, already worn thin by fever. Herbal poultices, applied with rough hands, promised relief, but brought their own torment. Mixtures of vinegar, onions and garlic were smeared over buboes, their sting biting into skin already raw. Mustard plasters burned the surface of the body, raising welts, leaving scars. The suffering was endured not because it eased pain, but because the absence of treatment was feared even more. The sick clung to remedies because they carried hope, however fragile, that something could keep death at bay. Water, too, made its presence felt here. Patients were sometimes plunged into cold baths, the chill shocking their fevered bodies in the belief that heat could be balanced by cold. Others were wrapped in damp cloths, left to sweat out the sickness. The weakness that followed was called progress, though it drained what little strength remained. The rooms of the plague doctors were not hospitals in the modern sense, but private chambers transformed by necessity. Shutters closed against the world, straw spread across floors to absorb what the body expelled, candles flickering in the heavy air. The doctor's arrival brought both dread and relief, for his presence signalled the depth of danger, but also the promise of some attempt, however desperate, at survival. Yet the treatments inflicted here did more than scar the body. They hollowed the spirit. Patients endured not only the agony of disease, but the pain of cure layered atop it. Families watched, helpless, as their loved ones bled into bowls, as their skin blackened under hot irons, as their cries faded into silence. The mask of the doctor, unchanging and expressionless, gave no comfort. It was a face of ritual, not of compassion. And still, there were those who lived, not because of the remedies, but in spite of them. Survival was attributed to treatments that had done little but wound, and so the practices continued, strengthened by the illusion of success. Each scar left by cautery, each faint mark from bleeding, became part of the testimony that the doctor had tried, that medicine had not abandoned the patient even in plague's grasp. The silence of these rooms grew heavier as death settled in. Corpses, wrapped quickly, were removed in carts, the straw beneath them replaced, the walls scrubbed with vinegar. The doctor moved on to the next house, the next bed, carrying the same instruments, the same rituals, the same certainty. His mask watched, unblinking, over countless final moments. What lingers in memory is not the plague itself, though its devastation was vast, but the image of suffering doubled, of pain meeting pain in the name of healing. The rooms echo with both illness and cure, indistinguishable in their cruelty. The fire of cautery, the slice of knives, the sting of herbs, the chill of water, all were threads woven into the same cloth of despair. The plague doctor became a symbol, not of medicine's triumph, but of its endurance. He stood as witness to agony, carrying with him the weight of centuries of failed cures. His silence was not indifference, but necessity, for no words could soften the remedies he delivered. In his stillness, the rooms themselves seemed to fall quiet, holding within their walls the unspoken truth that cure and torment had become inseparable. And so, history carries forward the image of these rooms, dim, air heavy with herbs, patient stretched on straw, the masked figure bending over them. A world where treatment was as feared as the disease itself, where the line between hope and harm blurred until they were the same. The silent rooms of plague doctors remind us that healing has not always been kind, that pain has often been the language of medicine. They are rooms where the body cried out, where the doctor listened only to the voice of tradition, and where silence at last covered everything. Covered. The centuries of rough cures and burning irons did not end abruptly. They thinned out like a mist, dissolving slowly as new methods entered the world. What had once been the unquestioned rhythm of medicine, the leech, the knife, the cautery, began to loosen its grip. And yet the change was not sudden relief. Pain did not vanish from the chamber of healing. It merely shifted form, hiding itself inside new instruments, new doctrines, and new hands. Hospitals grew more ordered, no longer dim houses scattered with straw, but halls designed to hold the sick together under one roof. The smell of herbs gave way to the sharper tang of chemicals. Glass bottles stood in neat rows, their labels carrying Latin names that seemed to promise authority. Iron instruments, polished until they gleamed, replaced the crude knives of the past. And with them came a new confidence, a belief that medicine had found firmer ground. But for those who lay upon the tables, the experience was not yet gentle. Surgery moved into the age of precision, but without the gift of anesthesia, in its early decades, every operation was still an ordeal of endurance. Patients were held down, sometimes by 4 or 5 assistants, as the surgeon's blade worked swiftly. Speed was considered the mark of skill. A leg amputated in under 2 minutes was praised as a triumph. Pain was not questioned, it was accepted, as though suffering was still part of the cure itself. Amputations remained common, for infection followed wounds with unrelenting certainty. The saw moved across bone with a sound that could not be forgotten, and though surgeons strove for swiftness, agony stretched each moment into something endless. Tourniquets were tightened, blood vessels tied off, yet the body still screamed its protest. When it was over, silence fell, but only for those too exhausted to cry further. The procedure itself was survival, but the pain, raw and immediate, was stitched into memory. Other treatments of this age carried their own burdens. Cupping and blistering endured, though now performed with more refined tools. Glass cups were heated, placed against the skin to draw blood to the surface, raising red domes that darkened into bruises. Cantharides, the Spanish fly, was ground into a powder, applied as a blistering agent. The skin bubbled, fluid seeped, and the burning did not cease for hours. The theory held that drawing irritation outward would pull illness with it, but the body bore the torment far longer than any fever it was meant to cure. Dentistry, too, found its place in this unfolding world. Teeth were pulled with forceps that clamped like iron fingers, the roots wrenched free with cracks that echoed through the jaw. No numbing agent softened the sensation. Each extraction was a lightning bolt of pain, followed by the slow throb of an empty socket. Those who endured it sometimes felt relief from the rot of infection, but the treatment itself left its own wound behind. Gradually, whispers of new ideas began to settle in. Experiments with ether and chloroform offered glimpses of a future where pain might be quieted. At first they were curiosities, demonstrations performed before audiences more curious than compassionate. But when the veil of unconsciousness descended over patients and they awoke without memory of the knife, something shifted. The surgeon's hands, once bound to speed, could linger now, could cut with deliberation rather than haste. Yet even here, the transition was slow, uneven, uncertain, doses were misjudged, and patients sometimes slipped too far into silence, never to return. Relief and risk balanced on the same fragile edge. Infection still stalked every wound. Before antiseptics, before sterilization, the very tools meant to heal carried sickness from one body to another. Surgeons washed little, their coats stiff with layers of dried blood that they wore like badges of experience. Needles were reused, blades passed from table to table. The pain of the knife was followed by the deeper pain of sepsis, a fever that burned hotter than the cautery of old, a torment that carried many into the quiet that medicine could not call back. And yet, step by step, the world inched toward change. The discovery of microbes shifted understanding, showing that illness was not born from vague airs, but from invisible life itself. Carbolic acid was sprayed into operating theatres, wounds washed with solutions that stung sharply but promised safety. The searing pain of infection lessened, though the treatments themselves were not kind. Antiseptics burned upon raw flesh, their fumes choking both patient and doctor. But they carried within them the beginning of something gentler, a promise that agony need not always accompany cure. The arrival of anesthesia and antisepsis together marked a turning point, but it was not an erasure of pain. Patients still awoke from unconsciousness to bodies stitched and bandaged, pain radiating through their limbs. Morphine and opium softened the edges, but dependence grew, and the line between relief and entrapment blurred. Pain had not left. It had only been disguised, layered under chemicals that numbed the senses, while binding the body to new struggles. Bloodletting slowly faded, though not without resistance. For centuries, it had been the universal answer, the ritual of opening the body to balance its humours. But as new knowledge spread, the bowls were set aside, the lancets dulled from disuse. The silence of those rooms deepened, for without the flow of blood into basins, without the hiss of irons pressed to skin, treatment began to look different. Pain was no longer seen as a measure of effectiveness. Gentleness was creeping into the language of healing. Still, the transition was uneven across lands and centuries. In some corners of the world, cautery irons continued to glow, leeches still clung to flesh, blistering powders were still applied. Modern hands did not sweep away the past in a single gesture. They folded it gradually into memory, allowing old rituals to linger, even as new sciences took root. A doctor's bag at the end of the 19th century might still carry both morphine and mustard plasters, both polished scalpels and jars of leeches. The old and the new sat together, their shadows overlapping. As medicine entered the 20th century, the weight of history still clung to its edges. War accelerated the craft, bringing with it new techniques of surgery, new methods of managing wounds, but also new ways for the body to be broken. Pain remained constant, though its shapes shifted. The gas of battlefields burned lungs, the shrapnel tore flesh, and hospitals filled with the echoes of earlier centuries, groans, cries, the quiet endurance of those who had no choice but to submit to the hands that sought to mend them. The final fade into modern hands was not marked by a single day, but by countless small gestures. The washing of instruments, the measured drop of chloroform, the needle filled with morphine, the careful stitch made without haste. These gestures carried with them centuries of trial, of torment mistaken for remedy, of pain endured as a necessary companion to healing. In their shadows lay the silent rooms of plague doctors, the cauterizing fires, the bowls of blood. In their light stood the fragile beginnings of something new, something that whispered of compassion alongside cure. Even today, the echoes remain. Modern medicine prides itself on precision, on safety, on the promise of relief, but beneath it lies the memory of a time when every cure burned, cut, or bled. To understand the present is to feel those echoes, to walk again through the long corridor of suffering where remedies were forged not from comfort, but from endurance. The hands that heal now carry tools far gentler, yet they are shaped by the memory of rougher instruments. The final fade was not a disappearance, but a transformation, a passage where pain did not vanish, but softened, where medicine learned, slowly, that healing need not wound as deeply as the disease. And so, as the centuries close behind, the story of painful treatments does not end. It lingers in the quiet knowledge that the past still breathes within the present. The silence of those old rooms, the cries of those who endured, the stillness of doctors who believed in suffering as remedy, all of it folds into the background of modern care. What we see now, in the light of sterile halls and clean instruments, is only the surface of medicine. Beneath it runs the memory of what came before, the long struggle of humanity with its own body, and the slow, uneven journey toward hands that heal without harm. And so, as the story drifts to its close, we have walked through long and quiet corridors of the past. We've sat beside those who endured the bite of stone blades, the sting of fire, the pressure of leeches, the weight of restraints, the sharp crack of bone saws, and the dark rooms where silence was the only comfort. These were not victories sung in halls or carved into monuments. They were smaller, heavier moments, the fragile attempts of humanity to push back against death, even when the cure was as painful as the wound itself. What we faced tonight was not just the history of medicine, but the history of endurance. Every scar, every cry, every faint breath that lingered after agony tells us something about the people who came before us. They suffered so that knowledge could move forward. They bore pain so that the thread of survival could continue, even when it seemed impossibly thin. As you close your eyes and let this story fade, remember that these are not just tales of cruelty or fear. They are also reminders of resilience, of the quiet determination that allowed generations to pass their lives on to us. The world we live in now, with its comforts and its gentle medicines, was shaped by those who came through that long night of suffering. If you found some calm in tonight's wandering through history, I invite you to let this channel drift with you again on another evening. Subscribe so that the next quiet story can find its way to you. Until then, may your night be gentle and your rest be deep.